The forest holds its secrets close. It always has. That part's not up for debate. The real question is, what do you let yourself believe when the impossible is staring you right in the face? The morning broke with a biting cold, the kind that seeps right into your bones and makes itself at home. Margaret Holloway was at her kitchen window, both hands clutching a coffee mug that had gone cold long ago, watching the fog lift from Cascade Creek like steam from a fire deep within the earth. The coffee tasted burnt. She drank it down regardless. Waste not, want not, her mother's words, ringing as true as they did 4 decades ago. It had been 6 years alone in this cabin. 6 years since Robert passed. 6 years of mornings that dragged on forever, while the nights fell way too soon. Somewhere along the way, she'd given up on the days and started marking time by the seasons. Winter, spring, summer, fall. Those were the only milestones that meant anything now. The rest was just empty space. The cabin was nestled on the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana, tucked away where the pines grew so dense, the sunlight only hit the forest floor in dappled patches. Robert had raised it himself over the course of 3 summers, back in the 70s, a time when his knees were still good and the future seemed like something you could build with your own 2 hands. Now, its boards were worn to a silver gray, the eastern roofline had a gentle dip, and the whole place groaned in the wind like an old man settling into his bones. But it was still standing, just as stubborn as the day he'd driven the last nail. At 62, Margaret had the kind of strength her generation of women earned, not from a gym, but from decades of hauling firewood, splitting, kindling, and carrying water when the pipes froze solid. Her hands were calloused, her shoulders sturdy under her flannel, and her hair had turned from brown to silver without her really noticing. She avoided mirrors mostly. What was the point in looking at a story you already knew by heart? A whine came from outside. It was Scout, a shepherd mix with a rust-colored coat, and a muzzle gone grey, a dog nearly as old as her time alone. He was Robert's dog, originally, but after the service, he'd simply shifted his allegiance to her, a quiet, unspoken agreement between them. Now he was on the porch steps, his tail giving a slow, steady wag, his gaze locked on the trailhead vanishing into the woods. Margaret put her mug down and pulled on her boots. They were Robert's, really a pair of brown leather danners that had shaped themselves to her feet over time, becoming a second skin. She tied the laces with the unhurried, deliberate motions of someone with nowhere to be and an entire day to get there. After shrugging on her canvas jacket, she hooked Scout's leash from the peg by the door, a habit more than a necessity, and walked out into the crisp morning air. The air was a sharp slap to the face, clean, cold, and electric with the scent of pine, creek water, and dirt still stiff with frost. She took a deep breath, feeling it clear her lungs, and the lingering haze from her coffee. This was the ritual, unchanged for 6 years. Every single morning, it was the same path, the same loop into the forest and home again, about 2 miles. Sometimes she'd talk to Scout, other times to Robert, but mostly she just walked, letting the quiet say the things that words never could. They headed north, on a trail that hugged the creek for about a quarter of a mile before ascending to higher ground. It was a narrow track, scarred by gnarled tree roots and rocks that pushed up from the soil like the earth's own skeleton breaking through. Margaret knew its every twist, its every hollow, every spot that held a puddle after a storm. She could have walked it with her eyes closed. Scout forged ahead, his nose glued to the ground, and his tail slicing the air in relaxed arcs. The canopy was alive with the calls of nuthatches and juncos, punctuated by the cry of a distant crow. Below them, the creek whispered over the rocks with its low, steady voice. The world was waking up and getting on with its day, just like any other. And then, halfway through their loop, Scout froze. It wasn't a gradual halt or a pause to investigate a scent. It was a dead stop, as if he'd run smack into a wall he couldn't see. His ears shot up, his tail went rigid, and a rumble began deep in his chest, a sound that started low and built into a clear warning. Margaret's brow furrowed as she peered ahead, her eyes following his stare to where the trail dropped off into a rocky ravine. The ravine was a deep gash in the landscape, an old wound in the earth that had never fully closed. 2 massive boulders stood guard at its mouth, each one 15 feet tall and twice as wide, their faces cloaked in lichen and ancient moss. "What do you see, boy?" Scout gave no answer. He didn't budge. He just stood his ground, every muscle coiled like a spring, his gaze fixed on the deep shadows between those two boulders. That's when Margaret heard it, too. A noise. It was low, strained, and raw. Not a groan, but not a cry, either. Something else entirely. It cut through the cold air and landed in the pit of her stomach like a stone. She stopped dead in her tracks. The air froze in her lungs. Scout let out a single sharp bark of alarm and shuffled a step backward. The sound echoed again, longer this time, and deeper. It was filled with a type of agony that spoke of trapped animals, of splintered bone, of a suffering that felt fundamentally wrong. Easy now, Margaret breathed. The word meant more for herself than for the dog. She froze for a moment. Her gut was screaming at her to turn back, to get to the cabin and bolt the door, to act like she'd heard nothing. But she'd spent 30 years in these woods. She knew the voice of this forest, the calls of deer and elk, the grunt of a bear, the scream of a mountain lion. She knew the sound of wind in the pines, of shifting rock, of ice breaking on the creek. This sound was none of those things. Slowly, she took one step forward, and then another. Scout whimpered but stayed with her, his body hugging her leg as if trying to tether her to safety. The mouth of the ravine loomed ahead, a narrow throat of pure shadow between the boulders. Margaret got down low, squinting into the gap, waiting for her eyes to pierce the gloom. At first, there was only rock and darkness, and the gnarled roots of a pine that had surrendered its fight for light decades ago. And then, a shape resolved itself from the darkness. It was huge, covered in fur, and pinned hard between the rock faces, as if the mountain itself had tried to swallow it whole. The breath left Margaret's body. The form shifted, just barely. The slightest movement of a massive shoulder, followed by the grating sound of hide against rock. And that's when she saw the arm as thick as a grown man's thigh and covered in matted, brown fur. It ended in a hand, one with fingers too long, a palm too wide, a hand that was both terrifyingly familiar and utterly alien. Her heart hammered against her ribs, hard and fast, the kind of primal fear that strikes before thought, before reason, before your mind can even catch up. The being, because what else could you call it, groaned again. The sound was a low, fractured rumble from deep in its chest, so filled with agony that Margaret felt an answering pang in her own. Scout let out a sharp, loud bark. The creature's head twitched slightly, just a fraction, and for a heartbeat, Margaret saw its face. Not clearly, not completely. Just an impression of its shape, broad, flat-nosed, and shadowed under a heavy brow. And its eyes, dark, wide, and fixed on her with an intensity that was both a warning and a plea. But she didn't run. Later, she would struggle to explain why. She'd tell herself it was just instinct, or compassion, or maybe the stubbornness of a woman who'd lived alone so long she'd forgotten the proper way to be afraid. But in that moment, at the ravine's edge, heart pounding, dog whining, and that impossible thing staring from the shadows, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. A connection. The creature wasn't trying to scare her. It wasn't hostile or aggressive. It was trapped, helpless, and suffering. And it was asking for help. Margaret backed away slowly, her thoughts racing. Scout nipped at her pant leg, trying to drag her away, but she ignored him. She stared into the space between the rocks, at the massive form that had no business existing, and made a decision. "I'll be back," she promised, her voice a mere whisper. "I'll come back with help." The creature made a soft sound then, almost a question, as if it understood. Margaret turned and hurried back up the trail, Scout trotting close, his ears pinned to his head. She didn't dare look back. She wouldn't let herself overthink what she'd seen. If she stopped to analyze it, she'd convince herself it wasn't real, and for some reason, she needed it to be. By the time she reached her cabin, her hands were shaking from something that wasn't the cold. It was a tremor from deep inside, from a place beyond logic. She pushed through the door, grabbed her old canvas pack from a hook, and began filling it on pure instinct. A water bottle, check. An old flannel shirt she could rip up for bandages, check. The heavy crowbar Robert had used on the fence posts, check. Rope, a flashlight, a thermos of hot coffee from the pot on the stove. Then she stopped, looking around her kitchen as if she'd never seen it before. What else do you bring to rescue something that isn't supposed to exist? Food. The creature must be starving. She grabbed 2 apples from a bowl. A half loaf of bread in wax paper, and a jar of peanut butter. Protein was important, wasn't it? She paused again, staring at the odd assortment of supplies on her kitchen table. "You've lost your mind," she said aloud. "You've completely and totally lost your damn mind." Scout tilted his head at her, ears perked, as if waiting for her to elaborate. Margaret let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. Then she shoved everything into the pack, slung it over her shoulder, and headed back out into the cold. The walk to the ravine felt longer this time, each step weighed down by a creeping doubt that she'd imagined it all. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe the shadows were playing tricks on her. Maybe 6 years of solitude had finally cracked her wide open, and this was how it started seeing things that weren't there. But when she got to the boulders and looked down into the gap, the creature was still there. Still trapped. Still suffering. Still real. Margaret set her pack down and approached slowly, her boots crunching on the loose rock. The creature didn't stir. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, and a thick, musky smell rose from it like wet fur and deep earth, and something wilder, something that had never known a roof over its head. "Easy now," Margaret murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." The creature's eyes opened. She hadn't even realized they were closed and focused on her with that same raw intensity as before. Watching, waiting. She knelt at the edge of the gap, her knees complaining against the cold stone, and peered into the darkness. Now that she was closer, she could see the problem clearly. The creature's leg was pinned by the larger of the two boulders, its thick brown fur matted with blood where the stone had crushed it. The wound looked bad, swollen, angry. The kind of injury that could turn fatal if infection set in. Margaret's throat went tight. She'd seen injuries like that before, on loggers, on hunters. Robert's cousin had his foot crushed in a tractor rollover back in the 1980s. The wound went septic, and despite all the doctors and prayers, he died 6 months later, cursing the world. She could not let that happen here. She absolutely wouldn't. "All right," she whispered, more to herself than to the beast. "Let's see what we can do about this." She pulled out her crowbar, sizing up the boulder. It was huge, at least a ton, probably more jammed at just the right angle to create the trap. If she could just budge it a couple of inches, make enough room for the leg to slip out. Margaret jammed the crowbar under the low side of the stone and threw her full weight onto it. The metal dug into the ground, caught a grip against the rock, and she pushed down with everything she had. Not a thing. The boulder didn't move an inch, not even a shudder. She went at it again, changing her angle, trying to find better leverage, putting everything she had into the effort. Sweat popped on her forehead despite the chill. Her shoulders were on fire. Her hands throbbed around the cold steel of the crowbar. Still, it was no use. "Come on," she hissed between clenched teeth. "Move, you stubborn thing." And that's when something incredible happened. The creature moved. It shifted its massive body forward, extending one enormous arm toward the boulder. Its hand, and it was undeniably a hand. Margaret saw it now. The long fingers and the opposable thumb, the way it gripped the stone with intent closed around the rock's edge. For a heartbeat, there was stillness. Margaret stood frozen, crowbar in hand, just watching as the creature braced itself. Then, it pushed. A deep, primal sound rumbled from its chest, a grunt of pure effort that seemed to make the very air hum. Muscles coiled under its thick fur, and tendons stood out like steel cables. The creature's entire body shook with the immense strain. The boulder moved. Only an inch. Maybe not even that. But it moved. Margaret snapped back into focus and jammed the crowbar deeper into the opening, using the momentum, adding her strength to the creature's. Together they pushed woman and beast, human and mystery, working as one in a moment that felt both impossible and completely right. The stone gave way. It rolled slowly at first, then picked up speed, tumbling clear of the opening and crashing into the dirt with a thunderous thud. The creature's leg was free. Margaret dropped the crowbar and scrambled over, her hands moving on instinct alone. The wound was bad, worse than she'd feared. Fur was matted and torn. The skin underneath was ripped and bleeding, the flesh swollen and dark. But the bone looked whole. That was something. That was everything. She twisted the cap off her water bottle and poured fresh water over the wound, cleaning away the grime and caked blood. Her hands surprisingly steady, even as her heart hammered in her chest. The creature didn't flinch. It didn't growl or snap or give any hint of aggression. It just watched her, its dark eyes locked on her face with an expression that felt startlingly like trust. Margaret ripped her flannel shirt into strips and wrapped them around the leg, making the bandage as tight as she dared. This wasn't real medical attention, not by a long shot, but it was something. It was better than leaving the wound exposed to the dirt, to infection, to whatever else lurked in these woods. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked up into the creature's face, really saw it. For the very first time, it was like staring at something from another reality. The features were almost human, the forward-facing eyes, the broad nose that wasn't quite animal, the mouth concealed by a curtain of dark hair that fell from its chin like a beard. But the proportions were off. The sheer scale of it was impossible, and its very presence felt so far beyond the known world that Margaret's mind couldn't even begin to process it. "What in the world are you?" she breathed. The creature didn't answer. Of course it couldn't. Yet something passed between them just then, a kind of understanding that went beyond words, beyond logic, beyond all the barriers people put up between themselves and the wild. Margaret reached into her pack for the loaf of bread. She tore off a piece and offered it, her hand shaking just a little. The creature's gaze shifted from her face to the bread and back to her face. Then, slowly, cautiously, it reached out and took the piece from her palm. The brief touch of its fingers on her skin sent a jolt up her arm. They were warm, calloused, and without a doubt, real. The creature brought the bread to its mouth and ate, chewing slowly and with what looked like great effort, its jaw moving in a way that spoke of pain. Margaret tore off another piece and gave it to him, then another and another. She kept going until one half of the loaf was gone and the creature stopped, its breathing a little less ragged, its body seeming to relax against the cold rock. She uncapped the water bottle again and held it out. The creature took it in both hands, hands that could easily crush her skull, yet held the simple plastic bottle with surprising care and drank for a long time. Water trickled down its chin, darkening the fur, and when it passed the bottle back, Margaret could have sworn she saw gratitude in its eyes. She stayed with it until the sun was high overhead, sitting on the cold ground with her back to a boulder, while the creature rested a couple of feet away. Scout lay between them, a silent bridge that neither had requested, but both appeared to accept. They didn't talk. They didn't have to. The quiet was all they needed. When Margaret finally got up to leave, her knees complaining after sitting for so long, the creature just watched her. She felt its eyes on her back the entire way up the trail, following her through the trees until the distance and shadows finally consumed her. That night, Margaret lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep, her mind replaying everything that had happened. What she had done, what she had seen, and what it all could possibly mean. Every logical fiber of her being tried to dismiss it. It had to be a bear, or some guy in a suit. Maybe just a ghost, conjured by loneliness. But her hands remembered the feel of that coarse fur, the heat radiating from its skin, the profound weight of its gaze, an intelligent, knowing look that held a spark of something terrifyingly like hope. She had set free something that defied all logic, nursed a creature that had no place in this world. And now, she was utterly lost about what the next chapter held. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, sounding like the world itself was breathing. In the distance, an owl's lonely call pierced the dark. And deeper in the forest, nestled in a hollow between two ancient stones, a nameless thing rested its wounded leg, its thoughts filled with the memory of the woman who'd shown it kindness. As the first light of dawn broke, Margaret found herself walking back to the ravine. She tried to convince herself it was practical to check the wound, to make sure it wasn't getting infected, to bring fresh food and water. But the truth was a heavy stone in her gut. She had to see it again. She had to know for certain that yesterday wasn't just a fantasy spun from her own desperate loneliness. This time, Scout followed without a second thought, trotting ahead as if this bizarre pilgrimage was already part of their daily life. The air was cold and crisp, the sky a piercing blue that only appears after a deep frost, as sharp and brilliant as shattered glass. Upon reaching the massive boulders, Margaret paused at the edge of the slope, her eyes scanning the hollow below. It was there. It was still there. Alive, awake, and watching her descent with those impossibly deep dark eyes. A wave of relief washed over her so powerfully her knees nearly gave out. She hadn't even let herself admit how terrified she was, that it would be gone, that she'd find only cold, empty stones, and the haunting doubt that it had all been in her head. "Morning," she murmured, making her way down into the ravine, her pack slung casually over her shoulder. The creature responded with a low, rumbling sound. It wasn't a growl, but it wasn't a purr either. It was something in between a note of greeting, of recognition that vibrated deep in Margaret's own chest, like the bass pedal of an old pipe organ. She dropped her pack and took out the provisions, more bread, a few apples, and a thermos of hot coffee. She figured it might help with the pain, or the shock, or whatever else a mythical, wounded beast might need. The reasoning was a long shot, she knew, but it was all she could offer. With the same delicate grace as the day before, the creature took the food, eating slowly and deliberately, leaving not a single crumb behind. When she offered the thermos, it sniffed the lid with caution, then took a tentative sip. Its eyes went wide for just a second. It took another sip, then another, until half the coffee was gone, and Margaret couldn't help but crack a small smile. "Yeah," she chuckled softly. "Robert used to say this coffee could wake the dead. I guess he wasn't too far off the mark." The being tilted its head, and in that moment, Margaret was certain it was truly listening, not just hearing the noise, but absorbing the meaning, trying to grasp the feeling behind her words. She knelt by its leg, carefully peeling back the makeshift bandage. The wound looked far better than she'd dared to hope. It was still raw and swollen, but there were no signs of infection, no angry red streaks, no foul odor, just living tissue fighting to mend itself against all odds. With gentle hands, Margaret flushed the wound again, dressing it in a fresh strip of cloth torn from an old work shirt. Her movements were a familiar, steady rhythm, honed by a lifetime of tending to injuries on the ranch, be it a gash on a horse, a feverish calf, or Robert, after a moment's carelessness, with a tool transforming the unbelievable into the deeply familiar. Once she was done, the creature reached out and gently touched her shoulder. Margaret went completely still. The touch was incredibly gentle, yet deliberate. A hand that could have easily snapped her in two was resting on her collarbone with no more pressure than a child's. Their eyes locked, and in that single, silent exchange, a profound understanding passed through Margaret that changed absolutely everything. This was no mere animal. This was a person. A different kind of person, an impossible one, but a person all the same. A thinking, feeling, hurting soul caught somewhere in the middle, too human to be just a beast of the wild, yet too wild to ever be one of us. "You're all alone out here," Margaret whispered, the words more a statement than a question. "Aren't you?" The hand pulled back. The creature averted its gaze, looking past her toward the trees, at something far away that only it could see. And for the first time in 6 long years, Margaret saw her own profound loneliness mirrored in the eyes of another. She stayed well past noon, much longer than she intended, longer than was probably safe. They simply sat in a comfortable silence, the creature leaning against the rock, Margaret on a nearby fallen log, with Scout asleep between them. They were just two beings sharing a space, drawing a quiet comfort from the simple, powerful fact of not being alone anymore. When Margaret finally got up to leave, a deep reluctance settled in her. The cabin would feel so empty. The afternoon would drag on forever. And she knew she'd spend every minute of it wondering if this surreal, impossible bond was real, or if it was just going to disappear like mist. "I'll be back tomorrow," she promised, the words hanging in the still air. The creature watched her ascend the slope, its gaze fixed on her until she vanished over the ridge. And Margaret could feel those eyes on her back the whole way, a tangible presence pulling her back, even as her feet carried her forward. The following 3 days fell into a rhythm. Margaret would rise before the sun, pack her supplies, and hike the trail to the ravine. The creature was always there, waiting. They would share a quiet meal. Margaret would tend to the wound, which was mending at an unnatural rate, the swelling vanishing, the skin knitting itself back together with a speed that bordered on miraculous. Then, on the 3rd day, the creature stood. Margaret was just finishing a new wrap on its leg when the immense form beside her stirred. She glanced up, just in time to witness it pushing itself up, its legs shaking and its arms straining against the boulder for balance. It was so much taller than she'd imagined, 7 feet at least. Its shoulders were wider than any man she'd ever seen. Its chest, a powerhouse of muscle hidden under a thick coat of dark brown fur. Fully upright, it wasn't a creature from a storybook, but something more ancient, something from an era before stories were even told, before people had names for the primeval beings that roamed the untamed wilderness. The being took a single, cautious step, and then another. The injured leg held firm just barely, but it held. Margaret realized she was holding her breath, watching. The creature lowered its gaze to meet hers, and in those deep eyes, she saw a reflection of her own spirit, that raw determination to push forward when every fiber of your being aches, when giving in would be so much simpler, when life has given you every excuse to just surrender. "That's it," Margaret whispered softly. "That's it. You're going to make it." And then, the creature made a noise unlike any she'd heard before. It was deeper, more intricate, a sequence of soft rumbles and clicks that felt like a proto-language, like pure meaning struggling to form a bridge across an impossible species divide. And from the deep woods, an answer echoed back. Margaret whirled around toward the sound, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. It was the exact same pattern, the same rumbles, the same clicks, but from another source, another voice entirely. The being next to her froze, utterly motionless. Its head snapped toward the call, its ears perked and alert under its shaggy mane. And then, it answered the call. The sound it made was immense. It flooded the ravine, bounced off the massive rocks, and rolled through the forest like a wave of thunder. Margaret felt the vibration deep in her chest, in her very bones, in the hollows where her heart was now racing out of control. A heavy, expectant silence descended. And then, faintly but clearly, the reply came once more. It was closer now. The creature looked down at Margaret one last time, and in its gaze, she understood it, all the gratitude, the goodbye, the shared knowledge that this connection was always fleeting, that a bridge between two worlds can only stand for so long before one must return to their own shore. "Go," Margaret whispered, a lump forming in her throat. "Go ahead. Your family is waiting." For a moment, the creature paused. Then, slowly, deliberately, it lifted a hand and touched Margaret's face. The touch was so gentle, so intentional, so achingly human that tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. She stood frozen, not even breathing, as this impossible being held its palm to her cheek, its thumb brushing away a tear, its fingers warm and calloused and real. Then, it turned and strode into the woods. Margaret watched it leave. She watched its massive form glide between the trees with an unexpected grace, despite its limp, until it vanished into the deepening shadows, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the frantic beat of her own heart. Scout let out a soft whine and leaned his body against her leg. "I know, boy," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I know." They remained there for a long time, the woman and her dog, gazing at the spot where the impossible had been real for just a handful of days, a place where loneliness found a friend, and the veil between worlds grew thin enough for compassion to cross over. Finally, Margaret hoisted her pack, called Scout to her side, and began the long trek home. The cabin felt more vacant than it ever had before. Margaret kept telling herself she knew it wouldn't last, that the creature would heal, leave, and go back to its life before the rock slide, the trap, and the woman who saved it. But knowing something in your head and feeling it in your heart are two different worlds. And right now, she was living deep inside the second one. She threw herself into chores. She chopped firewood, nailed down the loose board on the porch, and scrubbed the stove. She even made a pot of soup. She had no appetite for anything to keep her hands busy and her mind off the gaping void the creature had left. But later that night, lying in bed with Scout curled up by her feet, her thoughts drifted to Robert. She remembered how he'd filled parts of her life she never realized were empty until he was gone. She thought about how grief is more than just missing a person. It's missing the person you were with them, the version of yourself that only they could bring out. For 3 short days, she had been that person again. Someone who was needed, someone whose kindness made a difference, someone who was part of something far bigger than her own small, quiet world. And just like that, she was only Margaret again, alone in her cabin, getting older, waiting for a future that held no particular promise. Her sleep was a restless, shallow thing, haunted by visions of deep, dark eyes, gentle hands, and whispers that felt like a language just beyond her grasp, echoing through the desolate woods. But when she awoke, the world felt different. At first, Margaret couldn't put her finger on it. The cabin was unchanged. The morning sun slanted through the windows just as it always did. Scout was still a lump at the foot of her bed, his snores a soft rhythm in the quiet. Yet, the very air hummed with a new energy, thick with the unspoken, like the heavy calm before a thunderstorm, or the instant a secret is about to be revealed. She moved through her morning routine on autopilot, rising, dressing, making coffee more from muscle memory than any real want for it. Then she found herself standing at the kitchen window, gazing out at the tree line, and she felt the forest watching her in return. It was a feeling she could sense in her bones, not fear, not a threat, but the focused attention of a presence waiting for a sign, an invitation, the perfect moment to reveal itself. Margaret placed her coffee mug on the counter with a quiet finality. She pulled on her boots and jacket, then stepped out onto the cold wooden planks of the porch. The morning air was unnaturally still. No breeze stirred the trees. No birds sang their usual chorus. The only sounds were the distant murmur of the creek and the steady drip, drip, drip of last night's frost melting from the eaves. And then she saw them. At the edge of the clearing, where the path vanished into the woods, stood 3 figures. The breath hitched in Margaret's throat. They made no attempt to hide, not lurking in the shadows or trying to conceal themselves. They were just there, observing her with the ancient patience of the forest itself, waiting to see how she would react. The one on the left was tall, towering even over the one she had rescued, with a coat the color of ancient oak bark and shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of mountains. The next was smaller, more slender, its reddish-brown fur hinting at a youthful energy, a skittish curiosity, poised to flee in an instant. And the third was the one she had saved. She knew it with an immediate, unshakable certainty, the kind of recognition that transcends sight, like knowing a voice through static on a long-distance call. It was in the eyes, the familiar tilt of the head, the same silent intensity that laid her soul bare, a feeling that was equal parts terrifying and deeply comforting. Scout let out a low rumble from deep in his chest, but it died the moment Margaret laid a calming hand on his head. "It's all right, boy," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "It's okay." But was it okay? She had absolutely no idea. 3 impossible beings stood at the border of her land, their gaze filled with an intelligence and purpose that felt entirely deliberate. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to run back inside, bolt the door, and pretend none of this was happening. But for 6 long years, Margaret had lived by the rules of fear and loneliness, heeding the whispers that told her to keep herself small, to play it safe, to wall herself off from anything that could possibly cause her pain. And she was done listening to those voices. So she stepped off the porch and onto the damp earth. The 3 figures remained perfectly still. They neither advanced nor retreated, simply watching as she walked across the clearing. Scout stayed glued to her leg, and her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird desperate for escape. She stopped when about 20 feet of open ground separated them. The tall one, the elder, she sensed, its bearing radiating a quiet authority, took a single step forward. A test, a question. Margaret held her ground. The elder closed the distance between them, coming near enough for her to see the texture of its fur, the faint scars etched on its hands, and the profound wisdom in its eyes. It was a look that reminded her of ancient priests and solitary mountain sages, beings who had chosen silence over the world's noise because silence held a deeper truth. It reached into the thick ruff of fur at its neck and withdrew something she hadn't seen before, a rough cord woven from plant fibers, from which hung a small, carved stone. The stone was smooth, worn by ages of touch, and etched with symbols that, while foreign, sparked a faint sense of recognition deep within her. Like words from a forgotten, dream-spoken language, the elder extended its hand, offering her the stone. Her own hand trembled as she reached out to take it. The stone was warm from the creature's body heat, and it settled into her palm as if it were made for her, its weight solid, real, and undeniable. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice cracking with an emotion she couldn't name. "Thank you." The elder made a soft, guttural sound of approval. Then it turned its head and looked pointedly at the one whose life Margaret had saved. The younger creature came forward, its steps deliberate. It was still favoring the leg that had been caught, yet its movements gained assurance with each pace. Upon reaching Margaret, it paused, gazing down at her for what felt like an eternity. And then it did something utterly unbelievable. The creature knelt. The gesture was so startling, so packed with intentional meaning, that tears streamed down Margaret's face before she could even think to stop them. This colossal, impossible being, a creature that every textbook, scientist, and rational thought insisted couldn't exist, was kneeling before her like a knight to his queen, offering a sentiment that went beyond language, logic, or the lines drawn between species. It was an offering of respect, a sign of recognition, a silent vow that this moment was sacred, that her act of kindness had been seen, and that she would never be forgotten. Margaret slowly extended a hand, resting it upon the creature's head. The fur was thick and coarse against her palm, yet warm, real, and undeniably alive. She could feel the slow, steady rhythm of its breath, and sense it lean ever so slightly into her touch, seeking comfort just as any wounded being would. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. "You're going to be all right." The young creature rose to its full height and took a step back. The elder let out a deep, rumbling sound, and the three of them turned as one, their attention fixed on the tree line. Margaret stood frozen, watching them depart. She watched them glide between the pines with a grace that defied their immense size, saw them melt into the shadows and the distance, becoming mere silhouettes, then faint outlines, and finally, nothing at all, but their presence lingered. She could still feel them in the woods, a silent watch over the clearing they had shared, a connection that distance could not break. Scout came to her side and sat, looking up at her with a slow, knowing wag of his tail. "Yeah," Margaret breathed, brushing away tears with the back of her hand. "I know, boy, I know." She glanced down at the stone resting in her palm. In the dappled light, the carved symbols seemed to dance, hinting at a meaning she couldn't decipher, but could deeply feel. A promise of protection, a token of remembrance, a testament to how a single act of kindness can echo far beyond the moment it occurs. Clenching her fingers tightly around the stone, Margaret turned and walked back toward the cabin. After that, the days were never quite the same. Margaret continued her morning ritual, walking the trail each day. She'd still check the ravine, even knowing the creature was long gone. And she always left offerings of food and water by the boulders, just in case. The food was always gone by the next morning. The ground would be disturbed by tracks far too large for a bear, too deliberate to be accidental. But she never saw them again, not with her own eyes. Not like she had that morning when they stood at the edge of her clearing, proving that impossible beings could choose gentleness, that mercy could be understood and honored across the great divide between species. But she could always feel them. She felt them in the way the forest itself seemed more vibrant, more conscious. She felt them in the occasional, deep rumbling call that echoed through the trees at twilight, a sound that would make her freeze and listen with every fiber of her being. She felt them in the way certain stretches of the trail now felt, guarded, protected, as if some ancient power had claimed the space and deemed it safe. She took to wearing the stone around her neck, strung on the same coarse cord the elder had used. It lay against her sternum, a warm, solid weight, a constant reminder that she had brushed against something beyond the known world, that her life had crossed paths with a profound mystery and been forever altered. The loneliness hadn't vanished. Grief doesn't simply disappear after one incredible experience, but it had changed. It felt less like a final chapter and more like a quiet pause, a space between what was and what could be, between being alone and being connected, between the world she understood and the one that thrived just out of view. Margaret found herself speaking more on her walks, not just to Scout or to Robert's memory, but to the forest itself, to whatever was out there listening. She'd tell stories from her life, the things she'd seen, done, and wished she hadn't. She spoke of how Robert used to sing in the shower, terribly off-key and way too loud. She talked about her daughter in Seattle, who called twice a year but always sounded rushed. She described how coffee just tastes better while watching the sunrise, and the unique kind of quiet that settles over the world after a heavy snow. And every so often, as she headed back to the cabin in the fading evening light, a sound would rise from deep within the woods. It was never close, never threatening. It was simply a response, an acknowledgement, a voice in the wilderness saying, "I am here, I am listening. You are not alone." And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. 3 weeks after their departure, Margaret was jolted from sleep in the dead of night by Scout's barking. It wasn't his usual, "something's out there" bark. This was different. It was insistent. Not quite a warning, but a demand for her attention. Margaret shot up in bed, her heart hammering in her chest before she was fully awake. She snatched the flashlight from her nightstand, threw on her robe, and hurried after Scout, who was already at the front door. He stood rigid at the door, tail held high, and ears perked, his gaze locked on something just outside on the porch. Holding the flashlight high, Margaret cautiously eased the door open. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Just the familiar wooden porch, the rocking chair Robert had built by hand, and the pot of withered geraniums she kept meaning to throw out. Just then, her flashlight beam snagged on something resting at the very edge of the steps. It was a bundle, carefully wrapped in what looked like woven grass or reeds, and tied with the same rough, plant fiber cord as the stone she wore. Beside it, pressed deep into the wooden porch, was a single, enormous handprint. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Scout let out a soft whine, his tail now giving a slow wag, his internal threat assessment apparently over. She moved forward cautiously, kneeling beside the package. Her hands shook as she worked the cord free, and the woven grass parted to reveal what was inside. Wildflowers, not the kind from a garden or a flower shop, but the kind that flourish deep in the woods, where human feet seldom tread. Delicate white trillium, purple lupine, and golden arnica. Every one of them was perfectly fresh, with flawless petals and stems arranged with incredible care. And tucked beneath the blossoms was a collection of smooth river stones, each etched with symbols like the one hanging around her neck, speaking of protection, remembrance, and gratitude. Margaret sank back on her heels, tears now freely streaming down her cheeks. It had returned. Not to ask for a single thing, not because it needed her help, but to offer something back. To communicate what words never could, that her kindness had meant something, that she had been seen, and that their bond was not just real but mutual, spanning the impossible gulf between their worlds. She carefully gathered the offering and brought it inside. The wildflowers found a home in a mason jar on the kitchen windowsill, perfectly placed to catch the morning sunday. The stones she arranged on the mantel, right next to the photograph of Robert, and all the other treasures that marked the times her life had been touched by love. That night, as she lay in bed with Scout snoring softly at her feet, Margaret clutched the carved stone at her throat and contemplated the nature of mercy. She thought about how it costs almost nothing, yet means everything. How the smallest acts of compassion create ripples you can never predict or contain. How the choice to help a suffering being even when it seems impossible, when it defies all logic, when every rational part of you screams to walk away, transforms. Not just the one who is saved, but also the savior. She had saved a creature that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. And in doing so, she had rescued a part of herself that had been trapped for 6 long years, pinned under the weight of grief, loneliness, and the crushing feeling that her life no longer mattered. But now, she knew better. Now she understood that mercy builds bridges between worlds, that kindness is a language more ancient than words, and that sometimes the most impossible things are the truest of all. And she knew she was no longer alone, that she would never be truly alone again, because somewhere out in the vast forests of the Bitterroot Mountains, something ancient, patient, and impossibly gentle was watching over her, nurturing their connection and honoring the bond forged between a woman and a creature when compassion conquered fear. The wind whispered through the pines outside, carrying the scent of wild places, of new growth, and that unique kind of silence that falls when you know something is listening. Margaret closed her eyes, and a small smile touched her lips. And deep in the forest, somewhere between the shadows and the starlight, something smiled back. Morning light streamed through the cabin windows, transforming dust motes into miniature galaxies. Margaret stood at the stove preparing coffee, a ritual so ingrained her hands moved on their own. Pour the water, measure the grounds, set the pot to boil. The same exact steps Robert had taught her 40 years ago, back when they were young and believed they had all the time in the world. She found herself touching the stone at her neck. The gesture had become a habit, a way to ground herself whenever the world felt too bizarre or too mundane. A reminder that impossible things were real, and that real things were often beyond understanding. Outside, the forest was stirring to life. Birds began their calls, squirrels chattered in the branches, and the creek sang its unending song. And beneath all that sound, there was a presence, watching, waiting, patient with a stillness only wild things possess, content just to exist without needing to be seen, grateful simply to share the same air, the same earth, this same brief moment in time. Margaret poured her coffee and stepped out onto the porch. Scout followed, his old bones groaning with the same complaints as her own. Both of them were just too stubborn to let age slow them down any more than it had to. The morning air was crisp and clear. Winter was on its way. She could feel it in the quality of the light, sharp and thin, and in the way the trees were beginning to draw their energy down into their roots, preparing for the long slumber ahead. She sipped her coffee, her gaze drifting toward the trail. She would walk it again this morning, just like always. The same path, the same rhythm, the same 2 miles that had evolved into something more than just exercise or routine. It had become a meditation, a prayer, a conversation with something far greater than herself. And maybe, just maybe, she would leave another offering at the ravine, a little more food, some fresh water, not because it was truly needed, but because the act of giving was its own form of prayer, its own way of saying, I remember, I see you, I honor the connection we share. Scout stood at her side, his tail giving a slow, steady wag, his eyes fixed on the tree line. He knew, dogs always do. They exist so naturally in the space between worlds, moving through both with an easy comfort, seeing things humans have trained themselves to ignore, accepting mystery as just another feature of the landscape. Margaret set her coffee mug down and began lacing up her boots. Robert's boots. They still fit her perfectly after all this time, still carrying her forward, one step at a time, through grief and wonder and all the uncharted territory in between. Come on, boy, she said softly. Let's go see what the forest wants to tell us today. Together they walked down the steps, woman and dog, as the morning sun cut through the pines in slanted rays. The trail unfolded before them, both familiar and mysterious at once. Every single step a choice to press on, to keep showing up, to hold on to the belief that mercy matters, that kindness echoes, and that some connections can transcend any boundary this world can create. Behind her, the cabin stood silently against the tree line. Inside, the wildflowers drank in the light. On the mantel, the carved stones held their ancient promises, and around her neck, another stone rested, warm against her skin, a vessel for the truth she had learned the hard way, that the most extraordinary gifts often spring from the most ordinary acts of compassion, that monsters are only stories, but mercy is real, and that the veil between worlds is thinner than we ever imagined, waiting only for us to reach out with open hands and a willing heart. The woods gathered them in, a silent welcome home, and in those deep places where the sun never quite breaks through, where old things stand watch and secrets keep themselves, a presence stirred. It was watching, remembering, and it was grateful. But a story like this doesn't just end. It never does. It just takes a breath, waiting in that quiet space between one heartbeat and the next, between what you believe and what you doubt, between the world you can see and the one that's just out of sight. Every morning, Margaret Holloway still walks that trail. She leaves little gifts that are gone by sunrise. Around her neck, she wears a stone etched with symbols no expert could ever decipher. And sometimes, when the light slants just so, and the wind whispers secrets from deep in the wilderness, she hears a sound, maybe a language, maybe a cry of longing, or maybe just the forest itself, breathing. She doesn't need to know for sure. The mystery itself is the whole point. The not knowing, that's the real answer. In a world that wants an explanation for everything, that needs to slap a label and a definition on it all, there's something holy in choosing to just live inside the question, in letting some things stay wild, unknowable, and real precisely because they refuse to be tamed by our understanding. Margaret gets that now. She feels it deep in her bones, in her blood, in the way her own heart beats, to a different rhythm. Ever since that morning, she heard a sound like suffering from the ravine and chose kindness over fear. She rescued something that shouldn't exist, and in turn, that impossible thing rescued her right back. What's left is silence, but it's the good kind. The kind that holds more meaning than words ever could, like water cupped in your hands. A quiet that doesn't need to be filled, or figured out, or defended, just that silence, and a deep gratitude. And the promise that kindness always makes, echoing out through the trees, across time, into all the lonely places where connection finally takes root, and strangers become something more. There are stories you tell, and stories you live. And then there are the ones that take root inside you, changing you from the inside out, making you bigger, softer, and more willing to believe in the impossible. This is one of those stories. Some stories never really end. They just hit pause. They linger in the back of your mind, in the quiet of 3 a.m, in that gap between what you believe and what you can't. This is one of them, and maybe that's all right. That year, the snow came early. One morning in late October, Margaret woke up to a world made new. every surface covered in a blanket of white that caught the dawn and shattered it like 1,000 tiny mirrors. The pines stooped low under the weight, their branches reaching for the ground, and the creek had fallen silent, its voice smothered under a layer of ice that would only grow thicker as winter took hold. She stood by the window, coffee mug in hand, just watching how the snow changed everything and nothing all at once. The trees were still there. The trail was still there. But the land itself felt older, like it was remembering winters long before cabins, long before people who figured they could fence in the wild with walls and fire. Scout whined by the door. His limp was more pronounced these days, his arthritis flaring up in the cold, but their morning walk was a ritual. It had been for years, and it would be, right up until the day one of them couldn't make the trip any longer. Margaret bundled up in extra layers, thermal underwear, thick wool socks, and Robert's old parka that still smelled of mothballs and memory. She wrapped a scarf around her neck, carefully tucking the carved stone inside her coat, where its familiar warmth rested against her throat like a second pulse. The cold outside was a physical thing. It bit at her nose and mouth, felt like it was turning to crystal in her lungs, making every breath a visible cloud. But there was a stark beauty in it, too. The kind that aches a little, reminding you that nothing lasts, that the world keeps spinning no matter what, and that winter eventually comes for every one of us. They took the trail slow. Scout's paws punched neat little holes in the fresh powder. Margaret's boots made a sharp crunch with every step, the only sound in the muffled quiet. Everything else was still. The birds had all gone. The squirrels were holed up, dreaming of spring. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. When they got to the ravine, Margaret froze. Someone or something had been there. The snow around the massive boulders was trampled, marked by tracks that were impossibly huge, impossibly human-like, and yet impossibly real. And right there, set with clear intention on the flat top of the lower boulder, was another offering. Margaret moved closer, her heart hammering a rhythm too fast for the frigid air. Scout stuck right by her side, his breath puffing out in little white clouds, his gaze fixed on the edge of the woods. The gift was a branch. At first glance, just a piece of wood, but it was so much more. It had been chosen with care, straight and strong, about 3 feet long, and the bark had been stripped clean from end to end. But what made Margaret's breath catch in her chest were the carvings. Someone had painstakingly etched symbols into the wood, the very same symbols from the stones on her fireplace mantel, from the one hanging around her neck. Protection, remembrance, and a new one she'd never seen before, a design that looked like 2 hands clasped together, or maybe twisting roots, or maybe both. Connection. With trembling fingers, Margaret picked up the branch. The wood felt smooth, worn by careful hands, and filled with purpose and meaning. It was a message, a gift. It was a way of saying everything that couldn't be spoken across the great divide between their two worlds. It said, "I remember you. I see you. I am still here." Her gaze swept the tree line, probing the deep shadows nestled between the pines. Stillness. No form emerged from the gloom. Yet, she felt it all the same, that unmistakable presence, observing from a respectful distance, as patient and ancient as the woods themselves. "Thank you," Margaret breathed into the frosty air, the words a quiet prayer. "Thank you." Silence was the only reply. But then again, she hadn't expected one. The branch she held was all the answer she needed. She lingered by the ravine far longer than usual that morning, ignoring the biting cold, Scout's impatient whimpers, and the creeping numbness in her feet. She had to be there. She had to honor this gift by truly taking it in, by allowing it the significance it so clearly deserved. At last, as the sun climbed higher, bleaching the blue-tinted snow to a brilliant white, she finally turned and made her way home. She placed the branch on the mantel, next to the collection of stones and the photograph of Robert. It belonged there, she decided. It fit right in with the other mementos, from moments her life had brushed against something bigger than herself, times when love, or grace, or simple kindness had broken through her defenses and reminded her that connection wasn't just possible, it was essential, it was everything. That night, the storm rolled in. Margaret knew it was on its way. You can't live in the mountains for 30 years and not learn to read the signs, the subtle shift in the light, the sudden silence of the wildlife, that specific weight in the air that warns you the heavens are about to unleash their power and put you in your place. She went through her familiar ritual to secure the cabin. She hauled in more firewood, latched the windows, and made sure the generator was gassed up, just in case. From his bed by the stove, Scout observed, his gaze tracking her every move with the calm wisdom of an old dog who'd seen his share of storms and knew this too would pass. It began with the wind, a whisper at first, then a rising howl, until it was a full-blown roar tearing through the pines like a furious freight train. The snow drove down sideways, a stinging, blinding sheet. The cabin shuddered. The windows rattled in their frames. Outside, the world vanished into a maelstrom of white. Margaret sat near the hearth, a book lying open but unread in her lap, her attention fixed on the sound of the storm trying to rip the cabin apart. Scout leaned heavily against her leg, a silent exchange of comfort passing between them. The lights flickered and died around 9 o'clock. Margaret lit a few candles, fed another log into the stove, and pulled a thick blanket around her shoulders. The darkness felt tangible, held back only by the flickering firelight that made the shadows dance wildly on the walls. The storm raged outside, but inside, the silence between the gusts of wind felt even more immense. She must have drifted off, because the next thing she knew, Scout's frantic barking jolted her awake. This wasn't his typical bark. It was something else entirely. Urgent, sharp, the kind of sound that meant something was wrong, that something required her attention, that the world had shifted in some important way. Margaret shot upright, disoriented, her heart already hammering in her chest. The fire had dwindled to glowing coals, and the candles had burned themselves out. The room was bathed in the faint, reddish glow of the embers, painting everything in deep shadow. Scout was at the front door, scratching at the wood, and letting out a low whine between his sharp barks. "What's going on, boy?" he answered with another insistent bark. Margaret got to her feet slowly, her stiff joints complaining with every move, and made her way to the window. She cupped her hands around her eyes, pressing them to the cold glass to peer out into the blizzard. At first, it was just a blur of swirling snow and wind-torn darkness, but as her eyes adjusted, she began to pick out shapes in the shadows, to find a pattern in the chaos. There was something out there on the porch. Something big. Something that had no business being there. Her breath clouded the pane of glass as her heart pounded against her ribs. Every survival instinct she had was screaming at her to back away, bolt the door, and wait for daylight. But Scout wasn't barking anymore. He was whining. And Margaret knew the difference all too well. A bark meant danger. A whine meant distress. She snatched the flashlight from its shelf by the door. Her free hand instinctively went to the stone hanging around her neck, drawing courage from its familiar weight. And then, she unlatched the door. The wind slammed into her like a physical blow. Icy snow peppered her face, stealing her breath and her sight. She raised the flashlight, cutting a beam of light through the swirling darkness on the porch. There it was, pressed up against the cabin wall, taking what little shelter it could from the storm's fury, was a figure Margaret recognized instantly, even through the driving snow and the gloom. It was small, smaller than the others she had glimpsed before. Its fur was the color of rust and fallen leaves, and it was shivering violently. It was the young one, the curious one, the same one that had stood at the edge of her clearing weeks ago, ready to flee but brave enough to hold its ground. 1,000 questions flooded Margaret's mind. What in God's name was it doing here? Why was it all alone? Where was its family? The creature looked up, and in the flashlight's beam, Margaret saw its eyes huge, terrified, and utterly exhausted. It was a plea for help, the same kind any hurt, lost being would make, a desperate act that shattered boundaries never meant to be broken, because sometimes survival just matters more than any rule. "Sweet Jesus," Margaret breathed. Her gaze shot past the creature, scanning the dark tree line for any sign of others. There was nothing, just the raging storm, the suffocating darkness, and that unique, bone-deep loneliness that comes when you're cut off from your kind in a wilderness that wants you dead. The creature made a noise, so small it was almost a whimper. It was shaking so hard Margaret could see its tremors cutting through the curtain of snow. She made a choice, one that was probably reckless, definitely dangerous, and absolutely the only thing she could bring herself to do. "Come on," she said, stepping back and pulling the door open wider. "Get inside." The creature hesitated, its eyes darting from Margaret to the open door to the warm light spilling out. She could practically see the war waging inside it, primal instinct versus raw need, wildness versus survival, All the ancient warnings that screamed humans were a threat fighting against the immediate truth that the storm would kill it out here. Need one out. The creature crept forward, not walking, but crawling, keeping its body low, trying to seem smaller, less threatening, and finally slipped over the threshold into Margaret's cabin. Scout backed away but didn't make a sound. He just watched with his head cocked, his tail giving a few uncertain wags, trying to make sense of this bizarre turn of events. Margaret shut the door, the click of the lock sealing the violent storm outside. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. The three of them were a frozen scene in the firelight: woman, dog, and impossible creature, all trying to process this new reality, this sacred line that had been crossed, this thing that was happening when every rule of nature said it shouldn't. The creature was soaked through. Melted snow ran in streams from its fur, pooling on the wooden floor. It shivered violently, its teeth chattering with a sound that was disturbingly, unnervingly human. Now that she could see it clearly, Margaret noticed other things. The way it favored its left side, the dark, matted fur around its shoulder, the faint, coppery smell of blood beneath its wild musk. Injured. Again. Or maybe, still. Okay, Margaret said, her voice miraculously steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Okay, let's get you warm first. Then we'll take a look at that shoulder. She moved deliberately, slowly, giving the creature every chance to bolt, to decide if this was a safe harbor or a clever trap. She grabbed a couple of old towels from the bathroom, ones she used for Scout, and approached with care. The creature watched her come. It didn't move. It didn't growl. It just sat there trembling, its eyes tracking her every motion with the hyper-focused attention of something that had learned about danger the hard way. Margaret knelt beside it and began to dry the wet fur, as gently as she could. The creature flinched at her first touch. Then slowly, tentatively, it relaxed, leaning into the towel and making small, quiet sounds that could have been relief or pain or just simple gratitude for the warmth. This close, Margaret could see it was younger than she'd thought. Not a child, not really, but not fully grown either. The equivalent of a teenager, maybe, still learning how the world worked, still making mistakes, still vulnerable in ways the adults no longer were. What happened to you? Margaret murmured as she worked. Where are your people? The creature made a sound in return. It was low and complex, almost as if it were trying to form an answer. When most of the water was gone, Margaret coaxed the creature closer to the fire. It moved stiffly, that left shoulder clearly causing it a great deal of pain. Scout followed, his curiosity finally winning out over his caution, and settled nearby to watch. Margaret built up the fire, adding more logs until a deep, penetrating heat filled the room. Then, she turned her attention to the shoulder. I need to see, she said softly. I need to see what's wrong. Can you let me look? Its eyes met hers. In the golden firelight, they seemed even more human than before. Intelligent, aware. It was weighing trust against fear, deciding from one second to the next whether to allow this profound intimacy. Finally, it shifted its weight, exposing the injured shoulder to her. Margaret's breath caught in her chest. The wound was bad. Not life-threatening, she guessed, but bad. A gash about 6 inches long, torn deep enough to see the muscle beneath, its edges ragged like something had ripped it open. Fresh blood welled up as the creature moved, darkening the fur around it to a deep crimson. What did this to you? Margaret asked, more to herself than anything else. A bear? Mountain lion? The being let out a sound. Was it agreement or something far more ancient? Its gaze drifted to the window, to the raging storm, to the unseen terror that had forced it into her world. Margaret sprang into action. She'd mended livestock, horses, even Robert that time. He nearly took his hand off with a saw and stubbornly refused a doctor. She could handle this. She had to. She set water to boil, sterilized a needle in the flame, and threaded it with heavy fishing line, the only thing that would hold. She then cleaned the gash with meticulous care, pouring stinging alcohol over it, ignoring the creature's pained growl as she washed away the grime and forest floor to ward off any festering. I know, Margaret whispered softly. I know this stings. Just hold on a little longer. The being's long fingers dug into the edge of the table she'd managed to guide it onto a chair where it sat. A giant hunched awkwardly in a world not built for it, letting out sounds that were pure agony, yet held no malice, no threat. Only the sound of pain being born, because there was no alternative. With a deep breath, Margaret began to stitch. Her hands were rock steady, guided by years of hard-won experience, of doing what had to be done. Every careful stitch was a prayer, pulling the torn edges together, sealing the wound to give the body a fighting chance to mend. The creature didn't flinch, didn't lash out. It just sat there, shuddering, emitting soft whimpers of distress, placing a profound trust in her that made Margaret's heart ache with the weight of it. Once the last stitch was tied, she wrapped the shoulder in clean linens and sank back, her own hands now trembling as the adrenaline faded. "There now," she said, her voice breathy. "That's the best I can offer." The being gently touched the dressing, its long fingers tracing the clean bandages as if trying to comprehend the act. Then, its gaze lifted and found Margaret's, and in that gaze, Margaret witnessed something that would be etched into her soul forever. It was recognition, not just of her face, but of the sacred pact they had just forged. The trust given, the vulnerability shared, the impossible leap of faith made across the chasm between their worlds, proving that compassion knows no species. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature extended its hand and gently touched her own. The touch was light, yet full of purpose. A silent gesture that spoke volumes where words would fail, a message of thanks, of acknowledgement, of a bond that would not be forgotten. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "You're welcome," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You will always find a safe harbor here." And so they sat for a long while, the woman, the being, and the dog, as the storm howled outside and the fire crackled within. In the quiet of the cabin, a silent understanding flowed between them, something more ancient than language, more primal than civilization, something that dismantled every barrier humanity had ever erected against the wild. At last, exhaustion claimed its due. The creature's eyelids grew heavy, its immense frame slumping toward the floor. Margaret retrieved heavy wool blankets, heirlooms from her grandmother, and fashioned a warm nest by the hearth. The being curled into the nest, cocooning itself in the unfamiliar comfort of human warmth, and was lost to sleep within moments. It was a profound, heavy slumber, filled with soft noises and twitches that spoke of dreams. What did such a creature dream of? Margaret wondered. Perhaps of family, of safety, of a place called home. Scout padded over and settled beside the sleeping form, his old body a warm, reassuring presence, offering the same timeless comfort dogs have given since their wolf ancestors first cast their lot with humankind. Margaret returned to her chair and simply watched them sleep. She watched the fire dance, casting long shadows on the walls. She listened as the storm finally exhausted its fury. She watched the impossible become real in her small living room, trying to grasp the meaning of it all. Tonight, she had crossed a threshold. She had welcomed the wild into her home. She had healed it with her own two hands. She had offered it sanctuary, blurring the lines between human and beast, safe and perilous, the world she knew and the one that lived only in whispers and shadows. And she felt not a single shred of regret, not for one single second. Because mercy doesn't ask for permission. Compassion doesn't consult a rulebook. And sometimes, the most profound act is to simply open your door to a soul in need, especially when every rational voice screams at you to keep it shut. Margaret pulled Robert's old familiar hunting jacket around her shoulders and closed her eyes. The storm would break, the sun would rise. There would be questions demanding answers. But for now, in this moment, there was only the warmth, the sound of steady breathing, and the profound comfort of not being alone. It was enough. It was more than enough. In fact, it was everything. And then she slept. Margaret awoke to a profound stillness. It wasn't the quiet of a lingering threat, but the unique, hushed silence that follows a great tempest, as if the world itself is holding its breath to survey the aftermath. The fire was nothing but cold ash. A pale grey light filtered through the windows, and the spot by the hearth, the nest of blankets where the creature had lain, was now empty. Margaret shot upright, her heart suddenly hammering in her chest. Was it gone? Had something happened? Or was it all just a fever dream born from the storm? But that wasn't it. The blankets were still there, crumpled and holding the faint impression of a large body. The used bandages were in the trash can, and Scout was standing by the door, tail wagging, looking back at her with an expression that screamed, "Asterisk! You have got to see this! Asterisk!" Margaret got to her feet, every joint groaning in protest, and crossed to the door. She opened it slowly, not knowing what she was about to find. The storm had passed. The world was utterly transformed, buried under 2 feet of pristine snow. Every surface smoothed and softened, trees bowing under the weight, the sky that specific, piercing blue that only appears after a winter storm has scrubbed the air clean. And there, pressed into the fresh snow on the porch, in the clearing, and along the trail beyond, were tracks. Huge ones, small ones, multiple sets of them, all converging on her cabin and then leading away, back toward the heart of the forest. Margaret stepped out onto the porch. Her breath formed a cloud in the frigid air. The sun was just breaking over the mountains, turning the snow from a deep blue to gold, then to a brilliant white. She followed the tracks with her eyes, reading the story they told. She could see where they came from multiple directions. A search party of individuals. She could see where they met right at her porch, at her door, at the place where one of their own had found sanctuary. She could see where they left together now, a family reunited, heading home. But there was something more. At the edge of the clearing, just where the tracks vanished into the trees, one of them had stopped, turned back, and left a message. Margaret pushed through the snow. It came up past her knees, soaking her pajama pants. But she didn't care until she reached the spot. There, arranged with deliberate care in the snow, was a collection of items. Pine cones, smooth river stones, feathers, pieces of moss, all placed with obvious intention, creating a pattern that was almost a picture, almost a language, almost a story. And in the very center, standing upright in the snow, was the branch she had been given weeks ago. The one with the carved symbols, the one that meant connection. Margaret knelt in the snow, her knees aching, her eyes filling with tears that had nothing to do with the cold. They had come for their little one, come through the blizzard, searching, refusing to give up. And when they found it safe, warm, and tended to by the same woman who'd shown them mercy before, they'd left this message, this acknowledgement. Asterisk, we see what you have done. We remember. You are not alone. Asterisk. Margaret touched the branch with trembling fingers. The wood was ice cold now, coated with a thin layer of frost. But beneath it, she could still feel the warmth of the hands that had carved it, the purpose behind every symbol, the meaning that went far beyond language. She looked toward the trees, toward the tracks disappearing into shadow and distance. Nothing moved. No shapes took form in the darkness. But she felt their presence anyway, watching from a safe distance, patient and eternal. Go on, she whispered. Go home. Keep them safe. The only answer was the wind moving through the pines, carrying with it the scent of wild places and growing things, and that particular quality of silence that comes only when something is listening. Margaret carefully gathered the offerings, the pine cones, the stones, the feathers, and carried them back to the cabin. They joined the others on the mantle, markers of moments when her life had intersected with a deep mystery and come away forever changed. The branch stayed where it was, standing in the snow like a small monument, visible from the cabin windows. A reminder, a promise, a bridge between worlds that would stand as long as the wood held, as long as memory lasted, as long as mercy mattered. The winter deepened its hold. Margaret fell into new rhythms. She still walked the trail every morning, though now she wore snowshoes and carried a walking stick, moving more slowly through the transformed landscape. She still left offerings at the ravine, food, water, small gifts that vanished by morning, and she still felt that presence, watching, waiting, grateful. But something had shifted. Some boundary had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The creatures weren't just a mystery anymore. They were individuals, personalities, a people in their own way. The elder with its quiet authority, the injured one she'd first saved, still limping slightly but growing stronger, and the young one, curious and brave, and apparently prone to getting into trouble. She knew them now, and they knew her. That changed everything. Word had gotten around town that Margaret Holloway was acting strange, stranger than usual. Anyway, people talked, said she'd been seen leaving food in the forest, said she wore some kind of primitive-looking jewelry, said she talked to the trees like they might answer back. Margaret didn't care. Let them talk. She'd been the weird widow in the woods for 6 years now. A few more rumors wouldn't hurt. But in February, something happened that made the rumors seem a lot less crazy. A group of hunters came through, tracking elk up near the high country. They were local boys, men she'd known most of her life, good people who respected the forest and hunted clean. They stopped by the cabin one evening, faces pale, hands shaking, asking if they could come in. Margaret made coffee and listened while they told their story. They were up near Devil's Ridge, tracking elk, when they heard it. They called it voices, but not really. It was closer to music, or maybe a language older than words themselves. The sound was all around them, seeping from the trees, echoing off the rocks, coming from everywhere at once, yet nowhere at all. And that's when they saw the tracks. Huge, walking on 2 feet. They looked too human to be a bear's, but way too big to be a man's. "We know what we saw," Jake Thompson insisted, his coffee cup clattering in its saucer. "And we know what we heard. But Margaret, we've hunted these woods our entire lives. We've never come across anything like this." Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee, choosing her words with care. "These mountains are ancient, older than any of us. It only makes sense they'd hold a few things we don't understand." "So you believe us?" asked Michael Chen, the youngest of the crew, barely 25 years old. "I believe that you saw exactly what you say you saw. Have you?" Jake started, then paused. "Have you ever seen something unusual out on your walks?" Margaret's mind flashed to the being asleep by her hearth, to the gifts arranged on her mantle, to the lone branch planted in the snow. She thought of all the secrets she was holding, all the delicate bridges she'd built between worlds that were perhaps never meant to connect. "I've seen plenty of things out in these woods," she said at last, "most of which I couldn't begin to explain. But I've come to realize that not everything needs an explanation. Some mysteries are supposed to remain mysteries." The hunters left soon after, still rattled but strangely reassured by Margaret's quiet acceptance. It was as if her belief, or at least her lack of disbelief, grounded their experience, making it feel more real and less like a slide into madness. Once they were gone, Margaret stood on her porch, gazing out at the tree line. The setting sun was casting hues of gold, pink, and purple across the snow. It was beautiful. It was heartbreaking. It was fleeting. "You're getting brave," she murmured to the empty air. "Letting yourselves be seen. Why are you doing this now?" There was no reply. But later that night, as she lay in bed with Scout snoring at her side, Margaret believed she had found the answer. These beings were revealing themselves because they had decided through some unknown reasoning or process that some humans could be trusted. Not all of them, not even most, but a select few. The ones who had shown mercy, kindness, and the courage to look past their own fear. They were cautiously testing the waters, extending a hand, building their own bridges. They were trying to see if coexistence was even an option in a world that had become too small to simply hide in anymore. The thought was terrifying. And yet, it was full of hope. It was the single most significant event to ever occur in these mountains, and only a few shaken hunters and one old widow even knew it was unfolding. Margaret shut her eyes, her fingers closing around the smooth stone she wore at her throat. Somewhere in the wilderness, choices were being made that would send ripples through the future, and like it or not, she was now a part of it. The responsibility was immense, the privilege felt sacred, and the fear, the paralyzing fear that she might do or say the wrong thing, that one single misstep could shatter this delicate trust, was a burden she knew she would carry for the rest of her days. But she would bear it, because some burdens are worth carrying, some bridges are worth building, even when you can't see the other side, and some mysteries are worth protecting, even if it means taking them to your grave. March brought a false spring warm days that turned the snow to slush and frigid nights that froze it solid, creating a treacherous world of ice, promise, and danger. Margaret moved with caution now, testing every footstep, knowing that a broken hip at 62 could spell the end of her independence, her cabin, and everything she had built for herself here. Scout was getting older, too. There were mornings he struggled to get out of bed, and walks where he'd only make it halfway down the path before turning for home, his eyes full of apology as his body just gave out. Margaret knew what it meant that time was running short for both of them, each in their own way. She began to spend more of her days on the porch, just watching the forest, committing to memory the dance of light, through the branches, the slow turn of the seasons across the land, and the simple fact that the world moves on, ready or not. And now, the creatures were visiting more frequently. They never got close, never near enough for a touch or a direct word. But she would catch glimpses of them in the dawn, or dusk figures slipping between the trees, shadows moving with too much intention to be a trick of the light, a presence that made the woods feel vibrantly alive, sentient, and filled with a significance it shouldn't possess. The younger one was the boldest, venturing the closest. It was still curious, still brave. At times it would stand right at the edge of the clearing just to watch her, its head tilted, obviously wanting to come nearer but restrained by a mix of instinct and orders from its elders. Margaret would offer a wave, just a small, non-threatening gesture, and the creature would copy it, that long arm rising, those fingers uncurling, mimicking the movement with a precision that made Margaret's heart ache. It was learning, it was growing, it was building its own bridge from its world to hers. One evening toward the end of March, Margaret was on the porch when Scout abruptly raised his head and let out a growl. It wasn't his usual warning sound. This was different, deeper, and filled with distress. "What's wrong, boy?" He struggled to his feet, shaking, and managed just 3 steps toward the door before his legs buckled. He fell onto his side, his breathing ragged and his eyes wide with fear. "Oh, Scout." Margaret collapsed to her knees beside him. His heart was thumping wildly, out of rhythm, and the color had drained from his tongue. He was dying. Right there in her arms, the way old dogs do when their bodies finally surrender. "No," Margaret pleaded, her voice a whisper as tears streamed down her cheeks. "No, please. Not yet. Not just yet." But bodies don't make deals, and hearts don't listen to desperate pleas. Scout's breathing became shallow, his eyes began to glaze over. He was leaving her, and she was utterly powerless to stop it. She gathered his old body into her lap, the dog who had been Robert's, and then became hers. The companion who had walked every single trail, who'd been present for every impossible moment, every crossing into the unknown. She just held him, rocking him gently, telling him he was a good boy, the very best boy, that he could finally rest, and that she would be okay. Scout's tail gave a single, faint thump against her leg, and then he was gone. Margaret just sat there in the fading light, holding his lifeless body, letting the raw grief pour through her. It was another loss, another final chapter. Another piece of her world was now just a memory, leaving behind that familiar, aching void where love used to reside. She lost all track of time. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. Time has a strange way of dissolving when you're grieving, but slowly, she became aware of something else, a presence. It was close, closer than the creatures ever ventured. Margaret lifted her head, her vision blurred by tears, and saw it standing at the very edge of the porch. It was the young one, the endlessly curious one, the one she had cared for during the storm. The creature was holding something, a plant with broad leaves and small white flowers that held a soft glow in the twilight. It took a deliberate step forward, and then another, until it was near enough for Margaret to touch. Then, it knelt the same slow, intentional gesture from months ago and laid the glowing plant down beside Scout's body. The creature looked directly at Margaret, and in its eyes, she saw an unmistakable understanding. It wasn't simple animal sympathy, not a mere instinct. It was a genuine recognition of what death was, what loss felt like, what it meant to watch a loved one go forever. It reached out, touching Scout's head with a gentle, almost reverent gesture. Then it rested a hand on Margaret's shoulder for a brief moment before it stood and silently retreated into the woods. Margaret sat alone with Scout's body and the mysterious plant, feeling a grief that was somehow less crushing, because it had been witnessed, acknowledged, and honored by something that clearly understood. Later, after she had buried Scout in the garden behind the cabin, said prayers to gods she wasn't sure existed, and washed her face trying to pretend she was okay, Margaret started researching the plant. It took hours of poring over books, struggling with a weak internet signal, and cross-referencing sources until her eyes burned. And then she found it. A rare alpine species that grew only at extreme elevations, in places humans seldom traveled. Indigenous peoples had used it in their mourning rituals, believing it helped guide souls to whatever lay beyond. The creature had known. Somehow, it had understood the meaning of Scout's passing, had known what was needed, and had brought the precise, perfect thing to honor a life that was over. Margaret sat at her kitchen table and cried, not from grief this time, but from something else, entirely a mix of gratitude, awe, and the specific kind of heartache that comes with realizing you're not alone, that compassion flows both ways, that the bridge between worlds carries traffic in both directions. She carefully pressed the dried flowers between the pages of Robert's Bible, then placed it on the mantle among the other tokens from times her life had been touched by profound mystery. Spring was slow to arrive that year, reluctant, as if unsure of itself. The snow melted away in uneven patches, revealing frozen ground and half-thawed mud. Margaret walked the trail alone now, her pace unhurried without Scout to set it, pausing more frequently to rest and to remember. The forest itself felt different without him. Quieter, more vacant, as if some fundamental connection had been severed and nothing knew how to repair it. And yet, the offerings continued. The creatures still observed from the trees, and the young one would still come to the edge of the clearing on occasion, watching Margaret with those impossibly intelligent eyes, its head tilted in constant curiosity. One morning in April, Margaret woke feeling strange, not sick, precisely, but altered, as if something deep inside her had shifted overnight, her body trying to communicate something her mind wasn't ready to hear. She made her coffee, had her toast, and went about her morning rituals, but the feeling lingered, a heaviness in her chest, an exhaustion that ran deeper than muscle or lack of sleep, a sense of winding down, of systems preparing to power off, of time slipping away faster than she'd anticipated. Margaret looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw the undeniable truth. She was dying, not today, not tomorrow, but soon, sooner than she had ever planned. The body she'd lived in for 62 years was finally giving its notice, preparing to quit, to cease, to return to the earth from which it was made. By all rights, she should have been terrified. She should have been calling a doctor, fighting and raging, and demanding more time. Instead, she felt a profound sense of calm, an almost peaceful acceptance. As if this was just the next step, the changing of another season, one final transition in a life that had been full of them. Well, she whispered to her own reflection, I guess this is it. She dressed and stepped onto the porch. The morning air was crisp but stunning, with the sun cresting the mountains and painting the last patches of snow a brilliant gold. Birds chirped their songs. The creek babbled on. The world just kept turning, completely unaware of one old woman's final chapter. Margaret settled into the rocking chair Robert had built with his own hands, her gaze fixed on the forest's edge. I'm dying, she announced to the trees, to anything out there that might be listening. Just thought you ought to know. Silence was her only reply. But then the wind stirred, whispering through the pines with a sound like a soft sigh, a quiet acknowledgement, as if the forest itself was absorbing the news, filing it away for what was to come. She rocked gently, watching the light shift across the valley, feeling the sun's warmth on her skin, and she reflected on the bridges she had built. Every moment of mercy, every time she had chosen compassion instead of fear, connection instead of caution, and mystery instead of certainty. She had lived it right, she decided. This life, this peculiar, solitary, and extraordinary existence in the mountains, filled with creatures from myth, sorrows that never fully faded, and a love that outlasted every goodbye. She had done it right, and when her time came, whenever it might be, however long she had, she would meet it just as she had met everything else. With open hands, a willing heart, and the belief that mercy forges its own immortality, echoing into a future she would never see but could always feel. The sun ascended, and the day truly began, and Margaret Holloway, rocking in her chair, smiled toward the forest and felt, for what might have been the first time in 6 long years, a sense of absolute and profound peace. Weeks drifted by. Spring settled in, becoming lush and real. The last of the snow vanished. Wildflowers forced their way up through the damp earth. The world was renewing itself, as it always did, unconcerned with any single ending, focused only on the next beginning. Meanwhile, Margaret's body continued its slow, steady betrayal. Some days were manageable. On others, she could hardly pull herself from bed. She gave up her walks on the trail. It was too far, too great a risk of collapsing alone, where no one would find her until it was far too late. Instead, her days were spent on the porch, her eyes on the forest, sipping coffee that no longer had any flavor, feeling time trickle through her grasp like fine sand. The offerings continued. Food left out would vanish. New gifts would appear smooth, carved stones, intricately woven grass, pine cones laid out in careful patterns. The creatures were watching, they understood, and they were trying, in their own silent language, to give comfort, to show solidarity, to be there for her ending just as she had been there for their healing. Then, one evening in May, As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple so beautiful and fleeting it ached to see, Margaret saw them, every single one of them. The elder stood in the middle of the clearing, immense and serene. Beside it was the one she had first rescued, still favoring its leg just a bit, but strong, whole, and alive because of her compassion. And out in front stood the young one, the inquisitive, brave one, closer than any of them had ever dared to venture. They made no effort to hide, no attempt to melt into the shadows or the trees. They were just standing there, completely in the open, in the fading light, allowing her to truly see them, perhaps for the very first time. Margaret pushed herself up from the chair, each movement now a deliberate effort, and made her way to the porch railing. Her hand instinctively went to the stone at her neck, its familiar weight, its familiar warmth, its familiar promise. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice a near whisper that still carried on the quiet evening air. "For all of it. For letting me see you. For putting your trust in me. For showing me this world is more than just loneliness and goodbyes." The young one stepped forward, and then again, until it stood right before her, close enough to reach out and touch. So close, Margaret could see every feature of its face, the ancient, wise eyes, the gentle set of its mouth, that impossible blend of human and something else entirely that defied all earthly classification. It slowly extended a hand and gently took Margaret's. The contact sent a jolt through her arm, into her chest, straight to her heart. It was warm. It was real, alive. A silent promise that this moment was sacred, that it would be remembered, that compassion forges bonds that cross the lines between species, time, and even death itself. They remained that way for a long while, the old woman and the young creature, bridging the impossible gap between their worlds for a final time. Then, the creature pulled back, raised its hand in the gesture Margaret herself had taught it. A wave, a goodbye, a promise to remember and return to the others. As one, the three of them turned and melted back into the forest, dissolving into shadow and distance until they were nothing more than shapes, then suggestions, and finally just the memory of something real that had existed for one brief, brilliant moment. Margaret went back to her chair, pulling Robert's old worn jacket tighter around her shoulders. The cold was setting in. She could feel it, not the chill of the night air, but a deeper, final cold, the one that comes for everyone in the end. She gazed up at the first stars pricking the darkening sky. She thought of Robert, maybe waiting for her somewhere. She thought of Scout, chasing through whatever woods exist beyond this life. She thought of all the love she had given, and all she had received, of every moment that had truly mattered, of all the bridges she had built. "Not a bad life," she murmured to the night. "Not bad at all." The wind whispered through the pines. The creek sang on with its timeless melody. And somewhere, deep within the forest, impossible creatures kept their vigil, honoring the woman who taught them mercy, holding space for her passing, just as she had held it for their mending. Some stories conclude with all the answers. This one concludes with questions, with its mystery intact. It ends with a unique kind of peace you find only when you stop demanding explanations and simply learn to accept grace. Margaret Holloway passed away 3 days later. They discovered her on the porch, settled in the rocking chair with Robert's jacket draped over her shoulders, her hand still grasping the carved stone at her neck. She looked like she was smiling, at peace. Already gone. The cabin was passed down to her daughter in Seattle, who quickly sold it to a California couple trying to get away from city life. They never grasped the meaning of the offerings on the mantle. They never hiked the path down to the ravine. They never glimpsed the figures that sometimes drifted between the trees at sunrise and sunset. But every now and then, they'd discover little gifts on their porch, pine cones, water-smoothed stones, braids of grass, things they would write off as debris blown in by the wind, a random collection of nothing that meant anything at all. They had no idea. They couldn't have known. They would never comprehend the bridges that had been built, the mercy that had been given, and the bonds that lasted long after every ending. But the forest knew. The creatures of the forest knew. And somewhere in that space between belief and doubt, between the possible and the impossible, between the world we think we know and the one that exists just out of sight, the story lives on. Margaret Holloway offered kindness to something that wasn't supposed to be real, and by doing so, she proved that mercy itself operates beyond the rules of logic, that compassion speaks a language far older than words, and that sometimes The most courageous thing you can do is open your door to a mystery and trust that love, no matter what shape it takes, will always find its way back home. The rest is quiet, the good kind of quiet, the kind that holds meaning the way cupped hands hold water, the kind that doesn't need to be broken or explained or defended, just quiet, and gratitude, and the promise that some connections reach beyond death itself, echoing into the future, carried by creatures who choose to remember the woman who saw them not as monsters, but as people, not as threats, but as family, not as impossible, but as gloriously, undeniably, mysteriously real. A wind whispers through the pines. The creek hums its song. The world keeps turning, and somewhere in the deep places where the sun never fully reaches, something ancient and patient and impossibly gentle stands watch over a cabin, a clearing, a memory, protecting, honoring, remembering, always remembering, because mercy forges its own kind of immortality. And love, no matter what form it takes, across any impossible divide, never truly dies. It simply changes its shape. It crosses over. It finds new ways to endure. Some people call them Bigfoot. Others call them Sasquatch. Many call them myths, just legends told around a campfire to scare the kids. But Margaret Holloway knew their true name. She knew it in her bones, in her blood, in the hollow space where her heart once beat. Kin, family, people, just people, trying to get by, trying to stay out of sight, trying to protect their young, honor their dead, and build their own bridges between the world they'd always known and the one that kept pushing in, kept changing, kept telling them to either adapt or vanish. Margaret chose to help them adapt, and they, in turn, chose to remember her for it, not with statues or newspaper articles or scientific evidence, but with gifts left on a porch, with silent vigils kept in the trees, with the kind of quiet loyalty that doesn't require an audience or approval or anything other than the knowledge that it is being given. That is how the story ends, not with a neat resolution, not with all the answers, but with the promise that mercy echoes, that compassion endures, that some bonds overcome every single boundary this world tries to put up, and that somewhere, deep in the forests of western Montana, if you know where to look, and when to look, and most importantly, how to truly see, you just might catch a glimpse of something impossible, something that will watch you right back, something that will decide, in its own time and in its own way, if you are the kind of person who deserves to see what's real. Most people aren't. Most people will look away, explain away the evidence, and choose comfortable stories over uncomfortable truths. But some people, the rare ones, the brave ones, the ones who have learned that kindness matters more than being right, those people just might get lucky. They might see what Margaret saw. They might touch what Margaret touched. They might build bridges to places no map will ever show and no guidebook will ever mention. And if you are one of those people, if you ever find yourself in the deep woods of Montana or the Pacific Northwest, or any of the wild places where ancient things still roam, and you hear something that sounds like a language, but isn't, or see tracks too large to be explained, or feel that distinct weight of being watched by something old and wise, remember Margaret, remember what she did, and just consider for a single moment that maybe mercy is its own form of magic, that compassion can create possibilities that logic can never explain, and that some mysteries aren't threats, but invitations. Open your door, offer your hand, trust that love speaks every language, crosses every border, and mends every broken thing. And maybe, just maybe, you will find what Margaret found. Not answers, not proof, but something so much better. Something that lives in the gap between the possible and the impossible, between the known and the unknown, between being alone and being connected. Something worth protecting, worth honoring, worth carrying forward into whatever lies ahead. The story never really ends. It just pauses, waiting for the next person brave enough to see past their fear, generous enough to offer kindness, and wise enough to know that not everything has to be understood to be real. The forest holds its breath, its unseen inhabitants keep their watch, and the pathways Margaret created remain, standing firm and holding true, a bridge between worlds for any soul brave enough to walk it. Will you? What if I told you I've met someone who knew her? What if I told you I've seen the photographs, the ones kept locked away? What if I told you that offerings are still left on that porch, even today, years after new owners who don't understand have moved in? Would any of that change a thing? Would it make it true? Would it make it matter?